What is up, guys? So, not too long ago, the 2019 to 2020 seasons of the Arrowverse came to an end, and with those seasons, and much like every other season of the Arrowverse, we got a couple new main villains. However, this time around, we got a lot of them. Not only are there the new main villains from the Arrowverse, a couple seasons of which had more than one, but there's also the new Black Lightning villains that are added retroactively, and there are a couple other main villains from mainly Arrow, but also a little bit from the Flash that I didn't include last time, but I want to include this time because I think they're close enough to be main villains to put in this video. It's also because, I probably wouldn't do this in a regular video because that would just take way too long with the sheer amount of villains, but this is a tier list. It's a lot easier and quicker to make, so I am including all of those villains. Anyway, with that in mind, there are 35 main villains in this video to rank, so that's what I'll be doing in this video, and the order you see here is no particular order, it's completely random. I'll be starting from the top left with Mirror Mistress or Mirror Master, and then ending in the bottom with Anthony Ivo. As you see there's like not even enough room for all of the villains. There's like a couple of villains over other villains. Anyway, I'll get to that. I'll get to all of these villains and rank them from basically F to S. So first off, we have the newest villain from The Flash, Ava McCulloch, aka Mirror Master. She's never really given a name, and if we're going off the comics, it was a guy, so it could be Mirror Master, could be also Mirror Mistress, but I'll just call her Eva. Eva was, I think, honestly, one of the worst villains, or at least main villains on The Flash. I didn't really like her. First of all, her costume, not great at all. Her whole master plan, even the actress, the writing, none of that was great. The only thing that I really liked was her powers and how they used the Mirrorverse, even though that also could have been better. But with that in mind, I don't really think she was all that good, and I'd put her in the D tier. And the only reason she's not in the F tier is because she wasn't terrible, and she definitely has redeeming qualities. So then there's Vandal Savage, the first villain from Legends of Tomorrow. It sucks that he wasn't as good as he could be because I think Vandal Savage is honestly one of the best DC villains. However, in the Arrowverse, he's really no better than the D tier. I'm not putting him in the F tier again because he does have some redeeming qualities, but he definitely is one of the worst villains. So this is a Black Lightning villain. This is Tobias Whale, the main villain of not only Season 2, but also really the main overarching villain of the show. I personally think he's probably the weakest part of the entire series, the entire Black Lightning show. I think that he's just such a cliche villain, like a cliche mob boss villain, which I really, really don't like. I really don't like that type of villain, and Tobias Whale is basically just that. He does have a semi-good rivalry with Black Lightning, so because of that, I'm not putting him in the F tier. But this is a third main villain in the D tier in a row. I gotta say, this wasn't planned. Again, this is a random order, but this is 3 D tiers in a row. So next up is Clifford DeVoe, aka The Thinker, which is the first decent enough villain in this video, in this list, in this order that I put here, the random order. The Thinker could have been honestly A tier if he just stuck with Neil Sandilands the entire season, but because they went from actor to actor where DeVoe switched bodies, that crippled the villain a lot and moved him from the A tier to probably around like the bottom or maybe the middle of the B tier, but he could have been really, really good. He could have been one of the best villains on The Flash. So this is Edward Fyers, the main villain of the flashbacks of Season 1 of Arrow. He was actually a decent villain. Yeah, he is a flashback villain, which is, it can't really be as good as the actual main villains of the shows, but as a flashback villain, and as the first villain really that Oliver ever faced chronologically, and also in the order of release, actually, as a main villain at least, he was a very, very decent, he was a very, very good villain for what he had to be, and also would be put in the B tier. So then we get to Eobard Thawne. You might notice that Eobard is in this list 3 times. One of them is for The Flash Season 1, another one is for Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, and the third one is for The Flash Season 5. Each one is a different season, and each one is being counted as a different main villain, because I think they're different enough. But the first one is probably, definitely the best one, Eobard Thawne from Season 1 of The Flash, which is a top-tier villain. We're doing a tier list here. He's going to be at the top of the tier in the S tier, as he is definitely one of the best main villains in the Arrowverse. Next up is General Shrieve, the main villain of Season 3's flashbacks of Arrow. He is probably the worst of the main villains of Arrow and the worst main villains of the flashbacks for sure, as he's completely forgettable. You can watch the entirety of Arrow and then look back at the villains and just completely forget of the existence of General Shrieve just because of his forgettability, and because he has really no redeeming factors. He's going to be going in the F tier. Savitar is a villain that initially, when he was like when he came out, season 3 of The Flash came out, he wasn't as beloved as the first two villains because it was a third speedster in a row and it was a little bit tiring. He is still not as good as the first two main villains, but looking back, I think he aged as a villain very, very well. His costume was awesome. His storyline is actually a lot more compelling than I remember it being, and just the fact that he's the third speedster in a row isn't enough to make him any lower on the list. He's still not an A tier villain, but I definitely think that he belongs in the B tier and probably right at the top of it. Next up is Ricardo Diaz. This time around, I'm just grouping together season 6 and 7 because while it is technically two different seasons, it is the same storyline, so for this time around at least, I'm not going to be separating them, which is kind of a shame for at least the season 7 version of Ricardo Diaz, who was a little bit better of a villain, as his rivalry with Oliver improved immensely. However, in season 6, the rivalry wasn't as good. It still was fine, but it isn't any better, and as a villain, with his season 6 and 7 storyline, he isn't, I think, any better than the C tier, but he definitely would be at the top of the C tier, verging on the bottom of the B tier. Next up is Raya, the main villain of Supergirl Season 2, who, not a good villain at all, basically no redeeming quality. She came into the show like a couple episodes before the end of the season. The actress isn't great, the storyline is stupid, her powers, nothing, like she's no threat compared to Supergirl. It's kind of weird that she was a villain at all with her powers. Because of all those things, I think Raya not only deserves to be in the F tier, but probably the bottom of the F tier, as she's the only villain in the entirety of the Arrowverse without a single redeeming quality, so I think that she might be the worst main villain we've ever had. However, I don't know, I'll just stop there. So then we have Eobard Thawne, aka the Reverse Flash, again from Legends of Tomorrow Season 2. Some people can say that this would be the Legion of Doom as the main villains, but honestly, if you look at the season, especially the final showdown, Damian Darhk and Malcolm Merlin are more secondary main villains than Eobard Thawne, the actual main villain of the season. However, if you want to include the rest of the Legion of Doom, that's fine. It wouldn't really change my placement on this list, as the Legion of Doom or Eobard Thawne from Season 2 of Legends of Tomorrow are definitely, I think, A-tier villains either way. So then there's Baron Ryder, the main villain of the flashbacks of Season 4 of Arrow. Much like General Shrieve, completely forgettable, somehow overshadowed by the also not great main villain of Season 4, Damian Darhk, as they have the same exact powers, and there's really nothing that Baron Ryder adds. His rivalry with Oliver is not great, and much like General Shrieve, I think he deserves to be in the F tier. Speaking of Damian Darhk, that's the next villain on this list, a character who was improved immensely after his debut season in Legends of Tomorrow seasons basically 1 to 5. He became a much better character, but in season 4 of Arrow, he was not good whatsoever. He was way too powerful for the Green Arrow. His rivalry with Oliver wasn't great, and while he was charming enough, putting him in the C tier, he wasn't great. He wasn't good enough to be in the B tier, and even in the C tier, he would be near the bottom. So next up is Rain, the first time that I think Supergirl had a good villain, as she was very threatening. That was definitely the best thing about her. She was a very threatening villain. Her storyline is fine, her rivalry with Supergirl is fine, but it's her threat level, and also just how cool of a villain she can be, that puts her in the B tier. Much like Savitar, Ra's al Ghul is a villain that initially I didn't really like, but looking back, he has aged very, very well as a villain, which is appropriate because Ra's al Ghul is known for aging very, very well. I mean, he's like a couple hundred years old, but anyway, he was actually not a bad villain at all. His rivalry with Oliver was pretty good, his storyline was decent, and basically everything about him as a villain none of it was amazing or anything, but none of it was bad either, and much like Savitar, I think I would put him in the B tier and say that he's a lot better than we initially gave him credit for. Then we have Adrian Chase, aka Prometheus, infamously known as my favorite villain in the Arrowverse, and that, it hasn't changed. He's still my favorite villain. Everything from his threat level, actually no, not his threat level, that was like maybe the one thing that wasn't amazing, but his rivalry with Oliver, his costume, his storyline, even the badassery, the actor, the Josh Segarra, the actor was amazing in the role. Everything came together to make my favorite main villain from the Arrowverse, and he goes in the S tier. So then there's Orland Dwyer, aka Cicada, who is not a great villain. Honestly, near the end of his villainous career, he was just a complete joke. I'll be putting him in the D tier, and the only reason he's not in the F tier is because he was a threatening villain in the beginning, and his storyline wasn't terrible, but how much of a joke he was near the end, how he always was defeated very easily by Team Flash, and then he somehow got away every single time. It was a complete joke, and he doesn't really deserve to be any higher than the D tier. So then there's Non, the first villain from Supergirl. He was just not a good villain whatsoever. Again, no redeeming qualities, very, very forgettable, and I would just very simply put him in the F tier. So then there's Malcolm Merlyn, aka the Dark Archer, the main villain of Arrow Season 1. He is so close to being the S tier. The only reason he's not, I honestly can't really think of a reason. It's just that I don't really see him being as good as the S tier villains. But he's great. His main villain, his rivalry with Oliver was amazing. The actor was so good in Season 1. His storyline was top notch. And I honestly can't think of a reason why, but I don't really think he's on par with the S tier villains. However, he's so close to the S tier and right at the top of the A tier. So then there's Martin Proctor, probably the least known villain from this list. He is the main villain of Black Lightning Season 1, and he is absolutely terrible. His rivalry with the Black Lightning team, real bad. One thing I really didn't like about him was the acting, the writing, and how he fit into the Season 1 storyline. It was all just F tier villain, and yeah, he goes right in the F tier. So then there's Grace Gibbons, aka Cicada, or Cicada version 2, Cicada 2. Initially when she debuted, it was a breath of fresh air because of how much of a joke the original Cicada was, and how much more threatening she was. However, when we got the rest of the season, she was not only just as much of a joke, but also her storyline and the acting and the writing just went more downhill than the original Cicada. And while the original Cicada had some redeeming qualities, other than how threatening she was near the beginning, this Cicada has nothing and belongs in the F tier. So then we have Mullis or Malice. I'll say Mullis because that's what I just got used to during the season, but the main villain of Legends of Tomorrow Season 3. Other than the Legion of Doom, who are all villains from other shows, Mullis is definitely the best main villain from Legends of Tomorrow, and the best main villain from Legends of Tomorrow that was originally a Legends of Tomorrow villain. He isn't an A tier villain, as I don't think he is on par with those villains, and he's also even in the B tier, not exactly at the top, but he is a good enough villain to be in the B tier, despite the fact that he is not only an original character, but also on Legends of Tomorrow, which frankly, for the most part, other than in Season 2 and 3, didn't really have all that great main villains. Speaking of a show that doesn't typically have great main villains, but this one is, and that's Supergirl, with the Season 4 main villain being Lex Luthor. Out of all the villains in the Arrowverse, Lex Luthor is by far the most famous, or at least outside of the Arrowverse, he is the most famous, and he's up there as one of the most famous villains of all time. It's pretty clear why. He's a pretty awesome villain, and somehow Supergirl pulled him off very, very well. Everything from the actor, the writing, his storyline, how he connects to everything. This version of Lex Luthor is surprisingly not only great, but also probably my favorite live-action version of Lex Luthor we've ever seen. Can't believe Supergirl pulled that off, but he is. The only reason he's not going to be in the S tier is because for this season specifically, he appeared in 3 total episodes. It's crazy how in those 3 episodes he made it all the way to the A tier, but because he wasn't in more, I'm only putting him in the A tier, not in the S tier. However, again, much like Malcolm Merlyn, he's on the verge of the S tier. So then there's Lachesis, the main villain of Legends of Tomorrow Season 5. She's not a very memorable villain. The only thing that I really remember about her is her powers, which aren't exactly boring. They are at least interesting enough in her connection to Charlie and all that. Anyway, she's not exactly the most memorable villain ever. And like I said, Legends of Tomorrow doesn't typically give us great villains. Right now, they're 2 for 5, which which isn't a great record. But Lachesis, I think, while she definitely doesn't deserve to be in the F tier, I would put her in the D tier and no higher. So then there's the main villain of the first half of Arrow Season 6, and that's Caden James. Caden James was a disappointment of a villain, not because I was expecting a lot from him, but because I was expecting somebody else, not a hacker, not somebody who Felicity would mainly go up against, somebody that Oliver would mainly go up against, and that's not really what we got. Because of that, Caden James would be very low in this list. However, the actor was good enough to put him in the D tier, and the writing and the storyline just weren't terrible, not F tier material, but he was definitely a disappointment of a villain, and he never really should have been the main villain of anything Arrow related. Also kind of like Damian Darhk. So then there's Constantine Kovar, the main villain of the Arrow Season 5 flashbacks. He's definitely up there as one of the better flashbacks main villains, but also he's really in the middle. Not as good as, spoiler alert, the villains we haven't gotten to yet, Anthony Ivo, and the villain we have gotten to already, Edward Fyers. Constantine Kovar isn't quite as good as them, but he's still a good enough villain to definitely not be in the F tier, not be in the D tier. However, I don't really think he's good enough to be in the B tier, and I definitely put him in the C tier because of it. So then there's Gravedigger, the main villain of Black Lightning Season 3, the only main villain from Black Lightning that I could say is a decent or even good main villain. Martin Proctor sucks, Tobias Whale sucks, however, Gravedigger was threatening, his powers were really cool, he had a good rivalry with Black Lightning, a great backstory, he was actually pretty badass. I'm not going to be putting him in the A tier, but I definitely would put him not only in the B tier, but fairly high in the B tier, as he was a surprisingly great main villain. So then there's Gamemne, the main villain of Supergirl Season 5. This is a villain, I didn't mention this for Mirror Master, but these are villains that didn't really get their time to shine near the end of the season, which is arguably one of the more important parts of the season, but the fact that these seasons were cut short near the end, they didn't really get their final showdown with the main villains. This is no more apparent than Gamemne, who we didn't really get to see anything from the character. I'm hoping that maybe in the first couple episodes of Season 6 of Supergirl, where we get to see more of this character, maybe she's going to be a little bit better, but as of right now, from what we've seen, I'm going to be putting her in the D tier. So then there's Hunter Zolomon, aka Zoom, a great main villain, much like Malcolm Merlyn and Lex Luthor, on the verge of the S tier. However, I'm going to be putting him in the A tier because, again, I don't really feel he's on par with the S tier villains, but again, there's nothing wrong with being in the A tier. Zoom is probably the most threatening villain in the Arrowverse. His costume is great, he's very scary, his rivalry with Barry is great, and his storyline was top notch. Again, not on par with the S tier villains, but definitely up there as one of the best villains in the Arrowverse. Speaking of one of the best villains in the Arrowverse, we have Slade Wilson, aka Deathstroke, the main villain of Arrow Season 2's flashbacks and present day. Slade Wilson was absolutely amazing. His rivalry with Oliver is incredible, his storyline is amazing, and he's badass. The actor was great. Everything about him was not only top tier, but clearly S tier, as he is one of the top 3 main villains in the Arrowverse, and he is on par with the other S tier villains. Then there's Mobius, aka the Anti-Monitor, the main villain of Arrow Season 8, also the main villain of Crisis on Infinite Earths, but we're not going to be focusing on that in this video, only really on Arrow Season 8. Now, the Anti-Monitor was a little bit disappointing in terms of his rivalry with Oliver Queen, his rivalry with the Justice League, if you want to call them that, and things like that. But the reason that I don't hold that against him is because how great of a storyline he had, which the storyline was amazing, the build up to the character, how threatening he was just with his, not his presence, but with his build up, and the build up of the season of Arrow Season 8, and how good that storyline and that build up made the season. Because of how good the Anti-Monitor and his storyline made Arrow Season 8, he is a lot better than the villain himself. And again, he isn't really on par with the A tier or S tier villains, but I would definitely put him in the B tier, despite the fact that as a villain himself, he was more C tier material, but again, his storyline was good enough to put him in the B tier. So then there's Ramsay Rosso, aka Bloodwork, who was a breath of fresh air for the Flash, who hadn't had a good enough main villain in a very long time. They haven't had certainly an A-tier villain since season 2 with Zoom. Ramsay Rosso was great, the actor was great, his storyline was great, the writing was great, his CGI form, while we didn't really see it all that much, was really, really cool. His connection to Crisis on Infinite Earths and the build-up to Crisis on Infinite Earths definitely worked very, very well. And again, the Flash hadn't had this in a very long time, but Bloodwork is the third A-tier and up main villain from the Flash. So then there's the main villain of Legends of Tomorrow Season 4, Neuron. Neuron is just a terrible, terrible main villain. The storyline for Neuron sucked. His rivalry with mainly Constantine, but also the rest of the Legends, not good. And he was so powerless against the Legends. I mean, Constantine defeated him with one spell near the end. It also doesn't help that he didn't have a constant actor. That's something that you connect with the main villain the most, unless they're a mostly CGI form like a Mullis or even Bloodwork when he's in Bloodwork form. The actor is what you connect with the most, and this character did not have one for the most part. Because of that, Neuron is going to the F tier and probably near the bottom of the F tier as well. So then there's Emiko Queen. Didn't really have an alternate identity, but in the comics she is called the Red Arrow, and she's also a hero, not a villain. That's already one thing against her. She shouldn't be a main villain or a villain at all. But another thing is the actress, gotta be honest, was completely terrible in the dramatic scenes where she's like angry or screaming at Oliver or something. That just didn't work at all. She wasn't a believable threat. Her rivalry with Oliver wasn't great. The storyline felt kind of weirdly tacked on to the lore of Arrow. And because of all those things, Emiko, while being near the top of this tier, she's going to the F tier. So then there's Alice, the main villain, or Beth Kane, aka Alice, the main villain of Batwoman Season 1, often touted as the only good thing from the show or the best thing from the show. I do agree that she's not bad at all, much like the rest of the show, but I wouldn't agree that she's exactly a great villain or even a good villain at all. She's decent enough, maybe decent enough to be in the C tier, but any higher I would never put her. Her rivalry with Kate is not as good as it should be. She's not threatening enough. She's not really all that believable as like a huge threat. The actress is good, the writing is good enough, the storyline is fine, but any higher than the C tier, I don't think she belongs. So then we have Eobard Thawne, aka the Reverse Flash, a main villain from the Flash Season 5, a season where it is his weakest season as a main villain. That isn't saying much because other seasons that he was the main villain, he was in the A and S tiers, but this time around, I don't really think he deserves to be in those tiers because the actor wasn't as good as he was in Season 1, not as good as Matt Letcher was in Legends of Tomorrow Season 2. The writing wasn't really as good, and while his rivalry was still amazing with Barry Allen or the Flash, his storyline was really good. Definitely the best part of that season, way better than Cicadas could ever hope to be, and he is still the Reverse Flash. He isn't really on par with his previous seasons, the other seasons that he was the main villain, so I'd put him in the B tier. Just goes to show how good of a villain he is. As his weakest season, he's still on par with all of these other decent to pretty great main villains. Finally, we have Anthony Ivo, a main villain from Arrow Season 2's flashbacks. As Slade was the main villain in the end, Anthony Ivo was the main villain for like the first half. He was probably the best main villain we ever got from the flashbacks, obviously other than Slade, but Slade is more than just a flashback main villain. Anthony Ivo is just a flashback main villain, and he's the best one that we got. The actor was great, his storyline was great, his motivation was really well done, his rivalry with Oliver and all those other characters, again, really good, and it's a shame there's no other room in the B tier because that is where I would put him, which I'll do anyway. So anyway, this is my 2020 version of the Arrowverse main villains tier list. There are now 35 main villains, which is just so many, but this is my tier list. The actual tiers aren't ranked within themselves, as you can see, like in the S tier. The Reverse Flash is higher than Prometheus, which he really wouldn't be. I'm not going to be reordering it here. I'm not going to be making a video ranking all of these main villains either. But this isn't a ranking, this is a tier list, just to show where these villains are on par with the other villains. And I think that Reverse Flash is not really all that worse than Prometheus. Not enough for it to be significant, only really a little bit, so they're mostly on par, and that's how a tier list works. But anyway, let me know your thoughts about this ranking and what yours is in the comments down below. Who would you put in the S tier, who would you put in the F tier, and everything in the middle. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.